All right, so does everyone have their sheet out? Okay, so we're working with simplifying radicals today. And on our do now problems, do you guys remember how we got some questions that were radicals, but they were not perfect squares? Do you guys know what perfect squares are? So I heard when two numbers multiply and when it has a square root, right? So the perfect squares are those numbers that we take the square root of and it's a whole number. So like what's the square root of 16? 4, right? So 16 is a perfect square. 4 also happens to be a perfect square, right? Because what's the square root of 4? 2, right? So we're going to first list our first 15 perfect squares. So do you guys know what the first perfect square is? 2. Does anything multiply two numbers by itself multiply to 2? No, right? So I heard someone say 1. So 1 is our first perfect square because 1 times 1 equals 1, right? So that's what it means to be a perfect square. What's our second perfect square? 4. All right, hold on, because we're going to make sure we want to write all the first 15 down, right? So we have 1, 4, I heard 9. Then what? So far we have 1, 4, 9, 16, 25, 36. If you're confused how we're getting these, we're just going down and doing, okay, 1 squared is 1, 2 squared is 4, 3 squared is 9, 4 squared is 16, 5 squared is 25, 6 squared is 36. So our next one would be 7 squared. What's 7 squared? 49. 8 squared is 64. 9 squared, 10 squared, 100. And again, squared just means, so when I'm saying 10 squared, that's the same as saying 10 times 10, right? Okay, so then 11 squared, this was one you guys might not know. 121, good. What about 12 squared? 13 squared? If you don't know, just plug it in, right? 169. 14 squared. And then our last one, 15 squared. 225. So does everyone see where we got those numbers from? Yeah? So if I asked you guys, what does it mean to be squared? Could you guys tell me? Yeah? Right, squared is just the number times itself, right? So you can square any number, but these are our first 15 perfect squares. So now we're going to talk about simplifying a radical. So what do you guys know or remember about simplifying a radical? Like if I asked you what radical 9 is, could you tell me what it was? 3, right? Why is it 3? Because the square root of 9 is 3, right? So I have it on the board here, but I said, what is radical 9? What did we do? We took the square root of 9, right? There's also a typo on your guys' paper. I have 3 times 3 times 3, but it should just be 3 times 3. I didn't catch it before I made copies. So we took the square root of 9. This is 3 times 3 equals 9. So what would the square root of 16 be? 4. Why? Right, so you can kind of go back and forth with it. So those 16 and 9 worked because they're perfect squares, right? So do you guys think that we can simplify a radical that is not a perfect square? Why not? Yeah. So we can simplify something that's not a perfect square. So today we're going to learn how to simplify radicals that are not perfect squares. So there's 3 steps to it. It can be more steps, you'll see, but it's really not that bad. So what we do is we're going to practice with radical 50. We have the steps here so you guys can follow along the steps. So what you want to do is you want to find the largest perfect square that goes into that number. So we can start by, we can just list the factors of 50 on the side. What are the factors of 50? 1 and 50, 2 times 25, 5 times 10. I think that's it. So our first step is to find the largest perfect square that is a factor of that number. So looking at our factors, is there a perfect square that's a factor of 50? What's the one number that's one of these factors that's a perfect square? 25, right? So 50 doesn't have any other ones. 25 is the only perfect square. So if we can say 25 times 2 equals 50, we can also say radical 25 times radical 2 equals radical 50. So that's just what we do. We found the largest perfect square. that's a factor of the number. So we're saying 25 times 2 equals 50. So we can also say radical 25 times radical 2 equals radical 50. So then our next step, we kind of did it right there, is break the number up into its two factors, one being the perfect square, and separate them into two square roots. So I would just write next to my step 2, radical 25 times radical 2. So we're just breaking up that 50 into two of its factor pairs, and one of them is a perfect square. And then our next step is to take the square root of the perfect square and put that answer next to whatever we have left under the square root. So what's the square root of 25? So I took the square root of my perfect square, and then I put that answer next to whatever we have left under the radical. So then I just put my radical 2 right there. And that's my answer, 5 radical 2. So does that make sense so far? Kinda. Because when we take radical 9, all we're doing is we're breaking it up into the two numbers that multiply to 9, right? So we did the same thing here, just it's not two of the same number, and one of them is a perfect square. We're going to do practice problems, but do you guys have any questions before we start the practice problems? No? Not yet? Okay. Okay, so the first example says negative radical 36. How do you guys think we do this one? Say it again? Okay, so I can see why you would think it would be 2 negative 6s. What if I just said radical 36? 6, right? So that's just what we do. We take the square root of 36, which is 6. This on the outside is really saying I want to do negative 1 times the square root of 36. So then you have negative 1 right here from that negative that's right outside of that radical. And then our answer is just negative 6. So if you're doing a simplifying radicals problem and you have a number outside next to the radical, it's just telling you, I want you to multiply that number with whatever your answer is. So you're just multiplying it. It's not really affecting the process of simplifying the radical. All right, let's try 32. Can everyone on their paper write out the factors of 32 and then try and pick what the perfect square is that goes into it? So just list the numbers that multiply together to 32. Remember, guys, if you don't remember or you can't think of all the factors, we can go to our y equals and do 32 divided by x and then press table to get our factors. All right, what do we get for our factors of 32, guys? So we have 1 and 32, 2 and 16, and 4 and 8. So out of those, what do we think the largest perfect square that goes into 32 is? 2 and 16, right? So now I'm going to split my 32 up into radical 2 times radical 16. So I have that written down now, radical 2 and radical 16. And now I have to take the square root of my perfect square. So what's the square root of radical 16? 4, right? So then I have 4, and then I put my leftover radical right there. So 4 radical 2. Mm-hmm. So on a problem like this one, though, what do you guys notice about the other factors of 32? What about 4 and 8? Right? There's another factor in there that's a perfect square. Is 4 the largest perfect square? No. So if you did 4 and 8, what we would do is, I'm going to do it up here in a different color. We want to pick the largest one because it cuts down the steps for us. But if we did radical 4 times radical 8, like let's say you didn't realize 16 was a perfect square, that would simplify to 2 radical 8. And then we would break down the 8 again, right? So we would, oh, I always do that. All right, it's going to stay like that. Okay, so we would break down the 8 again. What are the factors of 8? 4 and 2, right? So then I would break down the 8 into radical 4, radical 2, and that would turn to 2 times 2, radical 2, which is 4 rad 2. So that's more steps, right? And it might seem more complicated. I just wanted to show you because if you picked the smallest one, that's why we picked the largest one, so that we don't have to do it twice, right? Do you guys want to try 3 on your own? No? Okay, let's list the factors of 75. What are the factors of 75? Okay, everyone on your papers. So the factors, I don't know if everyone heard, we have 1 and 75, 3 and 25, 5 and 15. Circle the factor pair that's your largest perfect square. Circle. So the largest perfect square that goes into it is 25, right? So I'm going to rewrite 3 as I have to bring down my negative 2 that's outside of the radical 75. I'm going to write radical 3, radical 25. Now I'm just going to take the square root of my perfect square. So what's the square root of 25? 5, right? So now I have negative 2 times 5 times radical 3. And then I'm going to combine, right? What's negative 2 times 5? Negative 10. So then I have negative 10 radical 3. So we just have to make sure that when we have a question about simplifying radicals and we have a coefficient outside of that radical sign, that we're multiplying that with our simplified radical. So you can't just get rid of it. We still have to multiply it. Do you guys feel okay with this so far? It's not that bad, hopefully. There's 5 classwork questions on the back, so you guys can try those together or on your own if you want. And as we go, I'll put the answers up. And then if we have time, you can start the homework, but I don't know if we will.